Babu's Game Room.
Today we have phones that are more powerful and can put out better graphics than the arcade machines that towered over me when I was a kid. Portable gaming has changed into mobile gaming, and game design philosophy seems to have shifted from getting people to purchase a game to getting people to keep pumping money into a game. With so many games begging us for our time and our money, we might find ourselves looking at older games, even something as iconic as Mario, and asking, is it worth it? Today's episode features Super Mario Land, one of only 5 launch titles released for Nintendo's 1989 Game Boy. And it was a game which had to not only sell itself to players, but also help to sell an entire gaming device. Like last time, I'll be reviewing the game in terms of its historical value and legacy, its story, presentation, graphics, and sound, its gameplay, and whether or not it's worth your time and your money to play the game properly and legally. So, let's begin. This is Super Mario Land worth playing today? Look, show a picture of Mario to just about anyone aged 0 to 80 almost anywhere in the world, and they'll know who it is. My students in Korea often belt out the iconic do-do-do-do-do-do from Super Mario Bros., and this is a country that banned all Japanese media, including video games, from 1945 until about 2004. Mario is legendary and is probably the most recognizable video game character ever. But if you asked 1,000 gamers what their favorite Mario game is, you'd get tons of Super Mario World, Super Mario 64, Super Mario Bros. 3, Sunshine Galaxy Kart. But who would say Super Mario Land? Unless it was followed by a 2, I guess, but that's not this game. We already know Mario himself has an unrivaled legacy in video games, so let's take a closer look at Super Mario Land's specific history and legacy. Super Mario Land was the brainchild of Gunpei Yokoi, who is responsible for creating many iconic Nintendo products. The Game & Watch, the Game Boy, Rob, the Virtual Boy. And he even mentored Shigeru Miyamoto. In my opinion, Yokoi deserves a lot more recognition for his part in shaping Nintendo in the 80s and the 90s, and even before that. But since he left the company in 1996 and sadly passed away only a year later, he tends not to get mentioned so often these days. Thankfully, when we talk about old games in Nintendo's history, we get to mention him. So, thank you, Mr. Yokoi. Gunpei Yokoi basically invented portable video games with the Game & Watch, then invented the first good portable gaming console in the Game Boy, sorry Microvision, and then created a system-selling Mario game. Now, Super Mario Bros. On the NES, designed by Shigeru Miyamoto of course, codified what a side-scrolling platformer should be. Japan had seen Super Mario Bros. 3 already, which took everything great from the original, added a billion extra things, and made everything 10 times better. Gunpei Yokoi had to follow that up with Super Mario Land on weaker hardware and a colorless screen that was small enough to fit in your pocket back in 1989. Thankfully, baggy jeans were popular back then. In the West, it wasn't quite so bad. Super Mario Bros. 3 hadn't been released yet, and Super Mario Bros. 2 wasn't really a Super Mario Bros. Game. Well, kind of. That's another story, but it played differently than every other Mario game. So yes, Super Mario Land ended up beating Super Mario Bros. 3 to the market in the US by over 6 months. Standards were lower, and gamers knew what they were getting. It was going to be black and white, or black and green, and it wasn't going to play as nicely or look as good as any NES game, and it was going to be smaller and less complex, but it was going to be a game that you could play anywhere on the go. Wow! Now you can leave your Tiger Electronics games at home. Super Mario Land was received well, with some critics having complaints about tiny graphics or the game's length, but overall ratings tended to be very high. Maybe it was the novelty of having a portable Mario game, or maybe it really was that great. But what did Super Mario Land leave us as its legacy? Well, it takes place in the memorable Sarasa Land, where Mario rescues the princess from the evil Tatanga, and pilots an airplane to, There's almost nothing from the mainline Mario games, and almost everything from here seems to have been erased from the history books entirely. The only character who seems to have become a regular is Princess Daisy, and she was kind of a useless character in this game. And maybe she still is today. Don't hate me, Daisy fans. Actually, I didn't even know that it wasn't the same princess back in the day. When you rescue her, she poops into an enemy and the game says, "Oh, Daisy," which I thought was a euphemism like saying, "Oh, shoot. Oh." But the point is that only one thing introduced in this game is even really acknowledged today. In fact, it took until 2019, yes, this year, before the unique power-up in this game was ever seen again, aside from a reference in WarioWare Gold. Super Mario Land spawned at least one direct sequel, or two if you want to include Super Mario Land 3, or even more if you want to include Super Mario 3D Land or other land games, but the only similarities with those games are the word land signifying a portable release. That one direct sequel is one of the best platformers on the Game Boy though, so I would say that Super Mario Land 2 is the best thing that Super Mario Land gave us. Within the franchise, Super Mario Land seems like Super Mario Bros. 2, except in the other direction. While Super Mario Bros. 2 added a whole bunch of strange characters to the franchise because it wasn't planned to be a Mario game, Super Mario Land was planned to be a Mario game, but all of the new characters, settings, and mechanics disappeared from the franchise since. So let's talk about what Super Mario Land gave us, keeping in mind that most of it vanished along with the 80s. After rescuing Princess Princess Toadstool, from Bowser once or twice, Mario needs to leave the Mushroom Kingdom to rescue another kidnapped princess. Wow, Mario's more of a player than Player 1. So we have a new princess to match our new setting. She looks pretty much the same though. Anyways, a sky monster demon thing named Tatanga used evil magic to take over the inhabitants of the 4 kingdoms in Sarasa Land, and wants to marry Princess Daisy to rule the lands, so Mario has to save her. It's basically Super Mario Bros. Plot again, but we're not playing this game for the plot, are we? Now, the presentation is actually really cool, especially compared to the original Super Mario Bros. In the first game, the Mushroom Kingdom felt very samey. Brown blocks, green grass and hills, light blue skies, dark blue dungeons, and grey castles with red lava. Oh, and water. Water levels. But Sarasa Land's 4 kingdoms actually felt very distinct from one another. Birabuto Kingdom is based on Egypt, being a combination of pyramid and Egypt. It makes more sense in Japanese. And that featured pyramids, hieroglyphs, and even sphinx enemies that spit fire. Mario then apparently takes a flying saucer to the Muda Kingdom. Think Bermuda, which is filled with delicious sea creatures like fish, octopi, seahorses, and robots. The Eastern Kingdom is based on Easter Island, featuring living moai heads and a bunch of rock-based enemies. And finally, there's Chai Kingdom, which is based on... Seriously, Nintendo? China. Now that I think about it, if it were based off of India, because chai means tea, that would be cool. But it's not, it's definitely China. Listen to that music. Here there are Chinese serpent dragons and what I thought were Chinese dancing doll things, until I started writing the script and I learned that they're actually Chinese zombie ghost things. Thanks, instruction manual. Just looking at these 4 zones, you can see how much variety there is in the game's world. Impressive for something on the Game Boy, and I would say that this varied kind of setting holds up even today. Mario games can get a little bit repetitive. They've been using the same kinds of worlds for decades now. Normal, water, ice, fire, ghost, castle, cave, desert, and airship. That probably encompasses something like 95% of the settings for levels in 2D Mario games. And sure, having 10 different settings sounds like a lot of variety for one game, but for, 10 games? It works, sure, but it is repetitive. And seeing these new settings in Super Mario Land feels surprisingly fresh, so it's a shame that Nintendo seems to have ignored them. They would look great with updated graphics. So, let's talk about that now. Almost inevitably, games released towards the end of a console's life look much better than games released at launch. Developers learn how to get the most out of the hardware and push it to its limits, but at launch, you're really only getting an idea of what the system is capable of. As such, Super Mario Land isn't much of a graphics powerhouse even for its time. Now, keep in mind, it was incredible to play Mario on the go back then, but as I mentioned earlier, even back then, some critics pointed out that Mario is tiny on the Game Boy. Because the developers didn't have much of a precedent for designing games like this on a small screen, they seem to have took a similar layout to Super Mario Bros. And shrunk it down to the Game Boy size. On an actual Game Boy, this can make it kind of hard to see exactly where Mario is standing or where he'll land from a jump. It's not game-breaking by any means, but it does take some getting used to. This isn't as much of a problem if you're playing the game on a Super Game Boy or something like that, so let's talk about the graphics under the assumption that we're seeing them the best way possible. Since Super Mario Land is such an old game, it doesn't have any special color features when played on the Game Boy, and it doesn't have any custom enhancements on the Super Game Boy, but it does have a predefined color palette on the Super Game Boy, which makes it look a bit nicer than other games compared to when you just plug any old Game Boy game in there. The background scenery looks cool, just enough to add to the experience without cluttering up the screen too much. The enemies are nice examples of 8-bit monochrome pixel art, looking equal parts cute and menacing, except the traditional Mario enemies, ironically enough. The Goombas and Koopas are too small to see, which occasionally makes them difficult to jump on, and they look pretty ugly too. Oh wait, these aren't Goombas and Koopas? Oh, they're Goombos and Nokobons! Carry on then, Super Mario Land. The coolest looking things are the bosses though. They have these big sprites with cool designs that just look very Game Boy to me. I like it. The special sprites for Mario also look pretty neat, but I'll save those for later. So the graphics are hit or miss, but the sound and music? Superb. Well, the music is, if you like 8-bit chiptune music. The first overworld track from Birabuto Kingdom is amazing, and if I made a list of my favorite 8-bit music pieces, this one would definitely make the cut. It's not as iconic as the NES tracks by any means, but it's such a fun, happy-go-lucky piece that gets stuck in your head without being annoying. The other tracks are great too. They're short pieces, but the levels are short enough that they don't get annoying or anything. I particularly like the dungeon theme as well, which sounds a lot more exciting and menacing than the original underground theme. The second overworld theme, from Muta Kingdom, is great as well. It just makes me feel happy to hear these tracks. And something special about the soundtrack is that, despite these coming from the single-speakered Game Boy, they have stereo sound. Yeah, plug in your headphones into the Game Boy and you'll hear that it's clearly a stereo mix. That's a nice touch that I wouldn't have expected to see, and it really adds to the listening experience instead of feeling like a gimmick. On the other hand, the sound effects work pretty well, but they don't sound very Mario-y. There are weird, distortion-y sounds when you defeat big enemies. And perhaps one of the funniest sounds the Game Boy can make is the sound when you deal damage to bosses. Other than that one sound, nothing ever really detracts from the gameplay or interrupts the music. Wait, what is Mario doing in a submarine? So let's start with the basics. You've got the 4 kingdoms, or worlds, and each one has 3 stages. That's a total of 12 stages for all the math wizards out there keeping count. Super Mario Land is a small game, but it wasn't intended to be big in the first place. You move Mario around with the D-pad, you jump with the A button and run with the B button. Jump on enemies to kill them, collect 100 coins for an extra life, and collect mushrooms, hearts, and flowers to power up your Mario. And if you get the flower power-up, you can also shoot fireballs with B. Wait, that's not how fireballs work. No, it's not a glitch. You don't become Fire Mario, you become Super Ball Mario. The Super Ball mechanic is actually pretty neat once you get the hang of it. The Super Balls not only bounce off the ground, but also off of obstacles like walls, blocks, and ceilings. They continue to bounce around until they expire after a few seconds, hit an enemy, or fall off the screen. This is a good thing, because the Super Balls can collect coins for you. They make it much easier to collect all the coins in the hidden underground bonus rooms. And that brings me to the difficulty of this game. It's easy, especially if you're a Mario veteran. While there is no save feature or even a level select cheat, I've never felt like it needed either, even when I was a kid and I found the game tricky. And something that makes it especially easy is the extreme abundance of coins. If you find the bonus rooms, they'll often be filled with coins, sometimes enough to earn you an extra life and then some in just one room. The levels themselves seem to have an abundance of coins compared to the NES games, and extra lives from hearts are not exactly rare either. To top that off, at the end of every level, if you can get to that top door up there, you have a chance to win up to 3 extra lives depending on your skill at this timing minigame. And you're guaranteed to get one of these bonus games after every boss stage. That's every third stage. So many chances for extra lives. But do you really need them? Well, maybe. See, Sarasa Land seems to have floors covered with honey. The ground somehow manages to feel simultaneously slippery and sticky. Mario doesn't quite have the same jumping precision as he did in his NES adventures, and there's also less maneuverability during jumps. It's a little disappointing to see, considering that Mario was the poster child for perfect platforming controls ever since the original Super Mario Bros. It doesn't make the game unplayable, but it does mean that you'll experience some cheap deaths, where Mario doesn't end up going where you expect him to. I may have also experienced falling through the edges of moving platforms, but maybe that was just my imagination. Overall, it just doesn't play as smoothly as you'd expect a proper Mario title to play. Another problem players might have with the game is that there's occasional slowdown when there's a lot happening on the screen at once, mostly caused by letting projectiles follow you into busier regions of a level. But it usually only lasts a very short time, and it tends not to have an effect on jumps or other tricky maneuvers. Actually, I have to admit that I kind of like slowdown in retro games, sometimes. I always saw it as a slow motion effect, like, wow, so much cool stuff is happening and we need this tense moment to play out in slow-mo. Maybe I'm weird, but then again, hardware limitations that caused slowdown is what made Space Invaders great. Other than that, the game seems to have the difficulty turned down quite a bit compared to other 2D Mario games. Perhaps the developers figured that the Game Boy might be many children's first gaming device and they'd need an easier game. Maybe the philosophy was that the game should be short and simple so that if players had to suddenly stop, or the Game Boy runs out of batteries, they wouldn't have lost a significant amount of progress. If that happens, you can just play through the first levels again and it'll be even easier the next time around since you already did it before. And okay, now I have to talk about it. Mario in a submarine. Why is he in a submarine? Presumably because Gunpei Yokoi wanted to demonstrate how a horizontal shoot-'em-up could work on the Game Boy, or he wanted to make Super Mario Land unique in the franchise. I don't know, but here it is. There are only 2 levels that play like this, one in a submarine and the other in an airplane. You can only move around and shoot, with a maximum of 3 shots on screen at a time. These segments are pretty easy, so players will be fine even if they've never played a side-scrolling shooter before. Even with the shot limit, mashing the buttons while avoiding obstacles can get players through these levels and even the bosses with little trouble. They're a nice break from platforming and don't feel like a needless distraction. To me, it feels like a welcome addition to a Mario game. They never overstay their welcome or anything. It's also a great way to introduce the shoot-'em-up genre to kids or people only familiar with platformers. Super Mario Land really did a lot of unique things with its gameplay when considering the franchise as a whole. Some were limitations of the Game Boy holding it back, and others were genuine attempts at creating a unique experience for players, some of which are still unique experiences in a Mario game today. If you've got half an hour to play a game, including starting up your console and downloading any updates, thanks for ruining some of my planned quick Rock Band sessions PlayStation 4, you can play and finish Super Mario Land in that time. If you're a Super Mario veteran, that is. If you're not, I'd budget an hour or so, including time for retrying failed levels. How Long to Beat agrees with me, with the upper estimates seeming to be about an hour and a half. The game also has a hard mode, which is unlocked by completing the game once. Unlike in Kirby's Dream Land, there's no cheat code you can punch in to unlock it automatically. If you want to experience hard mode, you have to beat the game once. No questions asked. Unless you have a Game Shark or something, I guess. Now, that might sound ridiculous, but remember that with the short length of the game, you could beat the regular game and hard mode in an hour or so if you're a pro. Now, that might sound short, and it is, but sometimes you just want a quick game. Something bite-sized that you can enjoy between games in your backlog, or something to do while downloading your next game. Super Mario Land was made to be a quick experience, and furthermore, it was made to be played multiple times. The benefit of such a short game is that it doesn't get old. You don't get tired of seeing the same backgrounds because you've only seen them once or twice each. You wonder if you can beat your record for your old timer score. You wonder if you can get into that new route, if you can beat the bosses using only the Super Ball power-up, or how far you can make it without taking any hits. I've always wondered how people can do so many runs in huge games like Skyrim or Dark Souls. It just seems like such a huge time investment. Kudos to those who can do it, but it's not for me. I like playing games like Super Mario Land sometimes because it doesn't eat up my real gaming time. Of course, this short game length will factor into how much someone would be willing to pay for it today. Being an original Game Boy game, Super Mario Land is playable on a ton of consoles. If you have a Game Boy, Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, or any other member of the Game Boy family except the Micro, or a Super Game Boy or even a Game Boy Player, you can play Super Mario Land on any of those. If you don't have the game, it goes for about $5 to $10, which is pretty steep for a Game Boy game. It costs a small premium because it has Mario in the title. If you're into buying retro games from eBay, you might actually find it on sale bundled with another game for less than the cost of Super Mario Land alone. This game is everywhere though, and I imagine a lot of people who have Game Boy games would already have this one. If you don't have any of those devices but you do have a 3DS, another way you can play the game legitimately would be to purchase it on the Nintendo 3DS eShop. Here it's a flat $3.99 depending on your region, so there's no need to do any price watching or anything. Keeping in mind the short length of the game, I think $3.99 isn't a bad price. I mean, I've definitely spent $3.99 on worse things before. The only catch is that the 3DS version doesn't seem to support palettes that are possible when playing on Game Boy players that support color. It's not a huge setback, but if you don't want to play Mario in black and white, then it's not ideal. It's much better than the original Game Boy's green and gray though, in my opinion. If you somehow don't have a 3DS or any of the Game Boy compatible consoles, the cheapest way to play it would probably be to try to find a Game Boy lot for sale on eBay or something that contains both a console and Super Mario Land, which would probably cost you about $30 plus shipping. For a game that you can probably only get a couple hours out of, it's probably not worth buying a new device for. But if you can find it cheaper than what the market usually dictates, or if you want to pick up this strange piece of Mario history on your 3DS, it might be worth the cost for you. Let's wrap things up with my ratings for Super Mario Land now. Keep in mind that I do enjoy the game and I have some nostalgia for it. If you disagree with anything, let me know what you think in the comments. Anyways, for helping to bring legitimacy to the Game Boy as a Nintendo console worthy of playing Mario games, but for contributing almost nothing permanent to the Mario franchise to the point of being almost non-canon, I give it a 1 out of 2 for its history and legacy. For having great music and a unique presentation for a Mario game, but for having tiny graphics that can hamper the gameplay on original hardware, I give it a 1 out of 2 for its overall presentation. For having some unique mechanics and elements in its gameplay while also being an easy game for beginners, but for perhaps being too easy for experienced gamers and for not playing quite like a Mario game, I give it a 1 out of 2 for its gameplay as well. For being an incredibly concise gaming experience that can be completely enjoyed in an hour, I give it a 2 out of 2 for its worth your time factor. And for not giving you much bang for your buck, but for being readily available on the 3DS and easy to find for sale in game bundles, I give it a 1 out of 2 for its worth your money factor, or a 0.5 out of 2 if you need to buy a console to play it on. So here's my rating for Super Mario Land, 6 out of 10. Again, I really like this game, so what does a 6 out of 10 mean? It means it'll be hit or miss for a lot of people wondering if they should play it today. It has its flaws and it shows its age, and while it was an important game when it came out, it's difficult to see the legacy it left us today. Mario fans aren't missing much if they don't play this game, but if they're looking for something different, it might be fun to try out. Maybe it's not the best game to add to your shopping list, but if you happen to have it lying around in a pile of Game Boy games, or if you have some Nintendo eShop credit you want to dump into your 3DS, I think it's worth considering this little curiosity of a Mario title. And its low difficulty might be good for introducing platformers to new gamers who might enjoy having access to all those extra lives, and being able to complete the game in a single sitting after a bit of practice is a definite plus for many people. Anyways, that's everything I have to say about Super Mario Land. Please leave any feedback for us in the comments, and subscribe if you want to see more. If you don't have anything to say, that's cool too. You can leave us a like and let us know that you liked the video. It's incredible that our last Is It Worth It video already has well over 200 views, and I really appreciate you all watching these. Thank you. Please let us know what other kinds of games you'd like to see reviewed like this, and until then, remember to have an awesome day and an awesome week.